On February 28, 1995, 20-year-old Kim Antonakis sat in front of her mirror getting ready to go out for the night in Brooklyn, New York. Kim had long, curly brown hair that matched her brown eyes, which were actually the only part of her appearance that she was never happy with. So she put on her favorite pair of gold earrings and leaned in close to the mirror to add the finishing touch, her blue contact lenses. Putting in those blue contacts made Kim feel like a different person. By day, she was a reserved college student who studied, did well in school, and worked hard at her part-time job. But by night, she was free and a bit wild, and men could not keep their eyes off of her or her blue eyes. Kim took a final look in the mirror and then walked through her ground floor apartment, a place most people her age in Brooklyn would have been jealous of. It had 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, and a private 2-car garage right across the street. Now, Kim alone could never have afforded this place, but luckily, her dad covered most of the rent. Kim looked over and saw her friends, April Deedley and Josh Torres, sitting on the couch watching TV. And April looked up and told Kim how pretty she looked and told Kim to go out and have a great time. April and Josh had been staying at Kim's place with their 2-year-old son for the last couple of weeks while the floors got refinished in their apartment. Kim loved getting to spend time with April and her little boy, but really, she was glad that Josh was there. Having a strong man in the apartment made her feel safer. And for most of the past month, Kim had not felt safe at all. In early January of that year, Kim had met a guy named Vladek, who actually went by the nickname Psycho. He was Russian, he was very good-looking, and he was a bit older than Kim. At first, Kim thought Psycho was one of those ironic nicknames, like when a really big guy gets called Tiny or something, because Psycho seemed like a lot of fun. He was laid back and really nice when they had met, but recently, that had all changed. Kim said goodnight to April and Josh, she put her coat on, and walked outside. It was about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which wasn't bad for a New York winter, but still, Kim felt a bit cold. She glanced up and down the street, looking for strange cars parked nearby or headlights coming down the road. Psycho had really begun to live up to his nickname starting about a month before, when Kim and Psycho had taken a quick trip to Florida together. Now, Kim had thought this getaway was just kind of a casual chance to go hit the beach and have some fun, but apparently Psycho saw things very differently. Because when they got back to New York, he got Kim's name tattooed on his leg, and then he proposed to her. Kim had broken things off right then. A marriage proposal was way too fast and way too serious for her, but since this breakup, Psycho had been basically stalking her. He called Kim constantly, and he came around and literally shouted at her from outside the apartment. And lately, Psycho had been showing up more and more often at her apartment because he had discovered that Kim had gotten back together with one of her ex-boyfriends, and so he was very jealous. And so Kim scanned the street one more time and saw that no one was there, and so she took a deep breath, like she was trying to relax herself. Then she walked to her garage, opened up the garage door, and then slid inside of her white Honda Civic car and cranked up the stereo. She loved all kinds of music, but hip-hop was her favorite when she was going out. Kim drove about 15 blocks to pick up her friend, and as she did this, she refused to let thoughts of Psycho come into her head because that would ruin her night, and she didn't want that. And so after getting her friend, the 2 young women had a great night out. They ate dinner and then eventually ended up at a club where they danced all night until the place shut down at about 4 a.m. on March 1st. Kim drove her friend home, and even though Kim was extremely tired from being out all night, she was in a great mood. And then after dropping her friend off, a few minutes later, Kim pulled into her own garage. By this point, Kim's contacts, her blue contacts, were starting to hurt her eyes. All she wanted to do was just take them out and fall asleep in her bed. She actually had to work later that day, so she really needed to get a few hours of sleep. Kim stepped out of her car, but immediately she froze because she heard something in the darkness. She turned, but she couldn't see anything, and then she heard a noise from the other side of her garage. Terrified, Kim just clutched her keys in her hand and rushed towards the open garage door. Later that day at 4 p.m., Kim's father, Tommy Antonakis, knocked on the door of his daughter's apartment. Kim's friend, April, opened up the door, carrying her son in her arms, and she could tell right away that Tommy was upset. She asked him what was going on, and he said he hadn't heard from his daughter all day. Tommy stepped inside the apartment, and at the same time, April's boyfriend, Josh, came over to say hello, but he also could see how upset Tommy looked, and so Josh just stayed quiet and kind of waited to be told what was going on. Tommy asked April and Josh if they had any idea where Kim was, and they would tell him that they actually hadn't heard from Kim since she left the night before to go out, but they also didn't want to tell her father that this was actually pretty normal for Kim. Josh and April figured that Kim had either gone home with the guy she met or maybe stayed out super late and crashed at her friend's house. But then Tommy told them that his daughter had not shown up for work that day. Kim actually worked for her father's girlfriend, and the girlfriend had called Tommy that day to let him know she was not in. At this, April and Josh both got very concerned looks on their faces. As much as Kim liked to go out and party and have a good time, she was also very responsible when it came to school and work. She would never just not show up for work without calling. And on top of that, Kim did have a cell phone, which still wasn't very common at this time, but she hadn't answered any of her father's calls. And so Josh asked if maybe Kim had tried calling Tommy at his house. But Tommy said he'd only missed one call on his home phone that day, and when he checked the message on his answering machine, it was just static, so he had no idea if, that was his daughter or not. And so Josh asked Tommy if he wanted to go down to the garage to see if Kim's car was there. Tommy agreed this was a good idea, so the two men made their way out of the apartment and across the street and opened the garage door. But Kim's white Honda Civic was not inside. Now, both men didn't know how to react to this. However, Josh kind of threw out there that, hey, this could be a good thing. This might mean Kim is actually still with her friend. But now Josh also looked as worried as Tommy. A few minutes later, Tommy left the garage and the apartment and went straight to the nearest police station. And when he got there, two officers listened to his story, but they told him that even though of course he was concerned, that realistically, an adult woman who hadn't even been gone for 24 hours at this point did not warrant a missing persons report, at least not yet. But Tommy begged them to please at least go to his daughter's apartment to see if maybe they could find anything out of the ordinary. And now at this point, Tommy was so distraught that the officers were actually worried that he might have a total mental breakdown right there in the station. And so they told him, okay, we'll swing by your daughter's apartment and have a quick look around. And so a little later that afternoon, Tommy stood outside of Kim's garage while the officers searched inside the garage. And at some point, one of the officers knelt down and waved his partner over because he had found a gold earring laying on the ground. And when Tommy heard this, he lost it. He said this had to be proof something bad happened to his daughter. The officers tried to calm him down, telling him, hey, her earring could have just fallen out when she got into the car. That's not totally out of the realm of possibility. But they did tell Tommy they would now issue a search for her vehicle and let him know if they found anything. Tommy then gave the officers a photo of Kim and said she had two distinct tattoos that people might have noticed, depending on how she was dressed. There was a scorpion on her left thigh and an infinity symbol on her lower back. The cops said they'd keep Tommy informed and then headed out. Tommy immediately went back to Kim's apartment, and when he got inside, he said to April and Josh that he knew something was wrong here, and he didn't think the police were taking him seriously. And so he asked Josh if he would help him put up missing person flyers with Kim's picture all around the city, and Josh said, yeah, whatever you need, I'll help you. And so while the two men laid out their plan for these missing person flyers, April contacted the friend that Kim had gone out with the night before. And the friend said that, her and Kim had stayed at the club until around 4 a.m. when it closed, and then afterward, Kim had dropped her off, and that was the last the friend had seen Kim. And so after April relayed this information to Tommy, Tommy became convinced that this, in conjunction with the earring that was found in the garage, meant something must have happened to Kim in the garage right when she got home after dropping off her friend. And so Tommy looked at Josh, totally despondent, and said they were already running out of time if they wanted to find Kim alive. On March 3rd, so 2 days after Kim had gone missing, Kim's mother arrived in town. Over the last 2 days, her ex-husband, Tommy, had continued to put up flyers all around the city, and the police had really ramped up their search for Kim and her car, but nobody had any idea where Kim was. So that's why Kim's mom had come to New York to conduct a search for her daughter in her own way. Kim's mother walked through a small row house in the Bay Bridge neighborhood of Brooklyn, and the house was dark and smelled of incense and candles. She stepped through a curtain at the back of the house and entered a room where a woman with long dark hair sat at a small wooden table. This was the psychic Kim's mother had come to see. The psychic told Kim's mom to take a seat and then asked her how could she help. Kim's mom fought back tears and said her daughter had not been seen in days. She put a photo of Kim and a few of Kim's personal belongings on the table, then she pulled out a small tape recorder from her purse and asked the psychic if she could record this session. The psychic nodded and then touched the objects that belonged to Kim. Then the psychic closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For a minute, the only sound in the room was the hypnotic click of the spinning tape in the tape recorder. Then the psychic opened her eyes and began talking. She said to Kim's mother that Kim was alive, but she was no longer in Brooklyn. She was tied up in some place cold and dark, maybe a basement. Then the psychic looked up like she was trying to see something in the room that was invisible to everybody else, and she told Kim's mom that different letters had begun to appear in front of her, and one of them was a big letter T. A moment later, the psychic sort of came out of her trance, and at this point, Kim's mom hit stop on the tape recorder. Later that day, Kim's mom met with April, Josh, and Kim's ex-boyfriend, Jay Negron, at Kim's apartment. Kim's mom knew that her daughter had started sleeping with Jay again, even though Kim didn't really like him. Kim's mom didn't think this was a good idea, but she was happy to see that Jay was there and willing to help. Kim's mom took out her tape recorder and said she had come from a meeting with a psychic. Jay stifled a laugh and glanced over at Josh and April, but they looked like they were taking this very seriously. The recording started, and Jay quickly stopped smirking. The psychic's voice on the recording sounded eerie, like it was coming from someplace far away. And when the psychic got to the part about seeing the letters in the room floating around, everybody got a deadly serious look on their face. April didn't want to say anything in front of Kim's mom, but she thought the letter T that the psychic saw clearly pointed to a particular person, Kim's father, Tommy, T for Tommy. At 2 a.m. on March 4th, 3 days after Kim had gone missing, a man woke up at his house in Queens, New York, about 30 minutes from Kim's apartment. The man smelled smoke, so he rushed out of his bedroom, but he quickly realized the smoke was not coming from inside of his house. So the man ran outside and looked down the street, and flames engulfed an old wooden 2-story house down the block, and smoke was pouring out of the windows. The man ran back inside and called 911, and he would tell the operator that the house that was on fire had been abandoned for a long time, but there could be squatters inside, so it was possible there were people in immediate danger right now. So the operator said they would send fire and rescue right away. Soon after that, fire trucks roared down the street with their sirens wailing, and they arrived in front of the abandoned burning house. Firefighters got right to work, and luckily, once they got inside, they could tell the house did seem to be empty, and they were able to put out the flames quickly. But then several firefighters walked through the now smoldering house to try to discover what the source of the fire had been. And one of them led the way down the stairs into the basement of this building, and he quickly told the others to stay back. He had seen some terrible things on this job, but what he saw in the basement was the worst he had ever seen. The others called down to him and asked if he was okay, and he just turned and shouted up that they needed to get the police down here right away. Later that morning, detectives Louis Pia and Tom Shelvin of the NYPD arrived at the burned-out building in Queens. Other cops thought that Pia and Shelvin made the perfect team. Pia could talk to anyone and seemed like their best friend right away, or maybe their favorite uncle. He was known on the force for getting guilty people to quickly confess to their crimes, because they suddenly just wanted to do the right thing and not let Pia down. On the other hand, Shelvin was quiet and methodical. Other cops said when he analyzed evidence at a scene, it was like he could transport himself to the moment of the crime and see exactly what had happened. Pia and Shelvin could still smell smoke as they walked through the burned-out house. They descended the stairs and stepped into the basement. And just like the firefighter, these two experienced New York homicide detectives could not believe what they were looking at. In the basement, slumped over in a burned-out chair, they saw an obvious corpse that was charred from the waist up. This person's clothes and their facial features had been completely and utterly burned off. The detectives walked closer to the body, and they were able to identify that the victim was almost certainly a woman, and she still had pieces of burned duct tape on her wrists that had been used to bind her hands behind her back. Detective Pia stared at the body. He knew it was not much of a consolation, but he said he hoped this poor woman was already dead by the time her body was on fire. Detective Shelvin crouched down to get a better look at the body, and as he did, he leaned in close, and he saw something on her left thigh that caught his attention. He shouted to Pia, and Pia also crouched down next to him. Through the very badly burned skin on this woman's leg, the detective saw a scorpion tattoo. The two detectives walked around the chair, which had actually mostly survived the blaze, intact, and they looked at the woman's back. Most of the skin was completely charred, but a small piece of skin on her lower back was not as badly burned as the rest of her. And that's where the detectives saw the infinity tattoo. Pia called into the station and was quickly put in touch with an officer who had been working a missing persons case in nearby Brooklyn. And the officer said those two tattoos that were found on the victim inside the basement matched the description of a young woman who'd been missing for a few days in the area. Pia knew he would need to get dental records to actually confirm everything, but he knew deep down they had just discovered the body of Kim Antonakis. The following day, detectives Pia and Shelvin met with April and Josh at their own apartment. The couple had moved out of Kim's apartment so her mother could stay there, and so now Josh and April, who were very shaken up, took turns speaking to the police about what happened to their friend, while the other parent would stay with the son. Pia and Shelvin wanted to know about any close relationships Kim had, particularly romantic or sexual relationships. Something about the horror and brutality at the crime scene had made the detectives think that maybe an angry or jealous boyfriend was the most likely culprit. April and Josh, who again were kind of shell-shocked by everything that had happened, basically said the same thing to police, that Kim had begun seeing her ex-boyfriend Jay again, but honestly that did not seem very serious. However, there was one person they felt like the cops needed to speak to right away, and that was Kim's other ex-boyfriend, whose nickname was Psycho. Now, the detectives couldn't believe this guy actually referred to himself as Psycho. It was like advertising yourself as a violent criminal. But then, after talking to April and Josh about how psychotic Psycho really had been after stalking Kim and being totally maniacal after she had broken up with him, well, the detectives were pretty sure they had the perfect suspect who, maybe his nickname was right on brand. And it didn't take them long to discover that Psycho had ties to the Russian mob in New York, and that he was out on bail from a statutory rape charge, and that he had a history of physically assaulting people who made him angry. So later that day, the detectives tracked down Psycho and called him into the station for questioning. Psycho walked into the interview room with a level of confidence the detectives weren't used to seeing in suspects. Psycho was tall, pale, blonde, had blue eyes and a light beard, and when he sat down across from the two detectives, he grinned and actually laughed before either of the detectives had asked him anything. Detective Pia told Psycho that Kim Antonakis had been murdered, and after that, Psycho just stared at Pia, completely calm and unaffected. And so Pia eventually broke the silence by asking Psycho how he knew Kim, and at this, Psycho smiled and laughed again. And then he said, the name Kim rings a bell, but I can't really picture her. Pia smiled right back at Psycho and asked, hey, if you don't know who Kim is, then why do you have her name tattooed on your leg? Psycho leaned back in his chair and got a look on his face like this was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. He said he did have the letters K-I-M tattooed on his leg, but it wasn't for this girl Kim. It stood for something that wouldn't make sense to these detectives. It was just a positive phrase that inspired him. The detectives looked at each other, and they almost started laughing. Psycho's act would be entertaining if he wasn't a murder suspect, so Pia leaned in and told Psycho to stop lying. The police knew Psycho had been coming around Kim's apartment after she broke up with him, and also several people had told the detectives that they had seen Psycho physically on Kim's block the day she disappeared. At this, Psycho lowered his eyes and dropped the tough guy act. He admitted to not only knowing Kim, but also dating her at one point, but he still insisted his tattoo had nothing to do with her and that their relationship wasn't actually all that serious. And then he told the detectives that he really had nothing to do with her death. By the end of the interview, despite Psycho seeming like a totally psychotic and very likely suspect, the detectives did not have enough information to actually hold Psycho, so they let him go. However, based on his criminal record and his connection to the victim, they were able to secure a warrant to conduct surveillance on him. The detectives hoped that surveillance would pay off quickly, but in the meantime, they decided to move on to another one of Kim's ex-boyfriends, Jay. A few days after Kim's murder, the detectives met with Jay at the station, and they had a much easier conversation than they'd had with Psycho. Jay told them that he and Kim had been dating for a while, and even though they split up for a time, they had been back together at the time that Kim disappeared and was ultimately killed. The detectives both took note of this. April and Josh had made it sound like Kim was sort of back with Jay, but it wasn't serious. They were just sleeping together, and so maybe this upset Jay. Maybe he wanted more from her. Maybe he did want to be fully back together, and, when Kim didn't want that, maybe he got angry and kidnapped and killed her in a rage. But the detectives didn't let on what they were thinking. Instead, they just let Jay keep on talking. And eventually, Jay would say that there was actually someone the cops needed to look into. At this, Pia raised his hand to stop Jay and said, yep, they'd already spoken to Psycho, but Jay shook his head. He wasn't talking about Psycho. The cops needed to investigate Kim's own father, Tommy. The detectives looked at each other surprised. Tommy had rushed to the police first, and he had been trying to find his daughter even before the NYPD launched a full-scale search, and Tommy, by all accounts, had been devastated the second he found out his daughter could be in trouble. So Pia asked Jay why on earth would he think Tommy had anything to do with what happened to his daughter. Now, Jay did not want to say the real reason, that a psychic had told Kim's mother about seeing a letter T floating in the air, because he figured the detectives would laugh in his face if that was his reason for suspecting Tommy. And so instead, Jay lowered his voice, like he was afraid somebody could be listening to him, and he told the detectives that he was pretty sure Kim's father, Tommy, had connections to the mafia. This seemed completely out of left field to the detectives, but Jay said he knew the family pretty well, and he really was not making this up. All they needed to do to confirm this was just look into Tommy's businesses. The detectives chatted with Jay for a bit longer, and then eventually they wrapped up the interview and thanked Jay for coming in and sent him home. After he was gone, the detectives struggled with what they had to do next. The idea of interrogating a father who had just lost his daughter in such a violent, horrific way made both detectives feel sick. But unless the cops surveilling Psycho found something basically right now, they had to keep digging if they were going to find out what happened to Kim. And so later that day, Pia and Shelvin drove to Tommy's house, and Tommy came to the door and welcomed them inside, but he looked horrible, like he hadn't slept in days. He was jittery, and he struggled to even put full sentences together. And then Pia told Tommy they were actually there to question him. And at this, Tommy lost it. He screamed that they were just wasting their time while his daughter's killer clearly was out there roaming the streets. And if they knew how to do their jobs, they would not be questioning him about the murder of his beloved daughter, the person who meant more to him than anybody else in the world. Pia told Tommy that it really was just routine for police to follow up with everyone who was close to the victim. And Tommy at this, managed to calm down a bit, but he was still very upset about this. And so Pia just got right to the point and asked if Tommy had any connections to the mafia. Tommy shook his head. He couldn't believe where this investigation was going. He said they could look into his businesses or whatever they wanted, and they wouldn't find any links to organized crime. He said yes, he did happen to have an office near the office of famous New York mobster John Gotti, and he had met some of Gotti's people in passing a couple of times, but that was it. There was no actual connection to the mafia. And then Tommy just began shouting for the detectives to do some real work and go find his daughter's killer. The detectives could tell Tommy was not willing to talk to them right now, so they quickly left the house and just headed back to the station. As a father, Pia knew how gut-wrenching it must be for Tommy to hear someone even suggest he might have done something to hurt his own child. But as the detectives dug into Tommy's potential ties to the mafia, something did jump out at them. Tommy owned several businesses, and one of them was a fire insurance company. Detective Shelvin said that, regardless of whether Tommy had mafia connections or not, as someone who dealt with fire insurance professionally, he would likely know how to burn a house down and leave nothing traceable behind. And if the guy in Queens hadn't smelled smoke and woken up when he did, there was a chance firefighters would have not stopped the blaze before it basically totally consumed Kim's body. Pia hated to even consider this theory, and he still hoped it was just a matter of time before Psycho or somebody else made a mistake and proved that Tommy had not murdered his own daughter. But as the days went by, police didn't seem to be getting closer to pinning down Psycho or anyone else. The case was just wide open. Police did, however, finally locate Kim's abandoned car miles away from her apartment, but it had been completely wiped down, so there were no prints to point the detectives in the right direction. And so soon, months went by with no new leads, and Pia and Shelvin felt like they were running out of ideas. So they engaged in what they called, quote, shoe leather work, end quote, literally walking the streets around Kim's apartment and the house in Queens where she had been found, knocking on doors and talking to anybody they could. It felt like a very thankless job. But then, in June of 1995, so 3 months after Kim's murder, the detectives got a call from a police officer in the Queens neighborhood they'd been walking around in, and they would tell the detectives that another body had turned up. And this body was a young man who had been murdered in the street, literally, mafia execution style. Pia and Shelvin got the victim's details and then sped to his house in Queens. When they got there, the victim's mother let them in and said they could look around to see if they could find anything that would help their case. She told them that she had no idea who had killed her son. However, she did tell them her son had begun hanging around what she considered to be a bad crowd. Pia sat and spoke to the very upset mother some more while Shelvin searched the house. And at some point, Shelvin got to a room at the back of the house and he looked out the window, and just over the fence, he could see the backyard of the abandoned house where Kim's body had been found. Shelvin walked back through the house and asked the mother if she'd ever seen anybody going in or out of that abandoned home, or if she knew if her son had ever gone in there for any reason. And the woman said, she hadn't seen anybody go in there for well over a month and really couldn't imagine why her son would have gone inside either. The detectives thanked her for her time, and then they headed back to their car. And once they got in there, they both agreed there was just no way this could be a big coincidence, that this young man who had been murdered mafia style just happened to live right behind the abandoned house where Kim had been murdered. And with all this talk about the mafia connection to Kim's murder, it just felt like this young man's murder had to be connected to Kim's in some way. They just didn't know what that way was. On September 3rd, 1995, so 6 months after Kim's murder, Detectives Pia and Shelvin sat at their desks and went over their notes like they had been doing almost every day since the murder. They had found a possible connection between Kim and that young man who was the shooting victim in Queens, but nothing concrete had come out of that yet. On top of that, Psycho, despite being under surveillance, had not shown his hand in any way, and also the detectives had discovered that Kim's father, Tommy, really had absolutely no discernible ties to the mafia. So at this point, none of their leads had panned out. However, the detectives refused to say that Kim's case had gone cold, but they admitted it was, at the very least, lukewarm. But just then, the detectives heard shouting and crying down the hall. They looked up and saw an officer leading a blonde woman towards them. The officer had an apologetic look on his face, and he said, this woman claimed to have vital information regarding Kim's murder, and she kind of barged her way down here. Now, a lot of people had made similar claims over the past several months, so Pia and Shelvin understood why this officer was hesitant to let this woman come down and talk to them right away, but they stood up and they could see how upset this woman was. Also, it looked like she had some serious bruising on her cheeks and around her eyes. So the detectives walked over to the woman and wanted to make sure she didn't need immediate medical attention, but the woman shook them off and said she needed cops, not doctors. Pia nodded and said, "Okay, well, what's your name?" And she smiled through tears and pointed to her hair and said everyone just called her Blondie. Pia smiled back at her and asked her to tell him and his partner, what's going on here. Blondie took a deep breath and stopped crying. She said that morning she and her boyfriend had gotten into an argument. Blondie said she was sure he was cheating on her. And so she got very upset and angry and began yelling at him, but instead of just yelling back at her, her boyfriend grabbed a shovel and hit her with it. Blondie fell to the floor and thought her boyfriend was going to literally kill her, but he ended up just running outside, stealing her motorcycle, and speeding off. Pia told Blondie, I'm so sorry, and then told her she really ought to go get some medical attention, but then he also asked her, what does this have to do with Kim's murder? Blondie glanced between Pia and Shelvin and took a deep breath, and then she said, while she was on the floor after being struck by the shovel and thinking she was about to be killed, her boyfriend, before running off, leaned down, got into her face, and told her he had already set one woman on fire and he would have no problem doing it again. The detectives asked Blondie who her boyfriend was, and when she gave them the name, they knew he had been telling Blondie the truth about previously burning someone because they knew her boyfriend had to be Kim's murderer. Based on the information Blondie provided, interviews, and evidence found at the crime scene, the following is a reconstruction of what the detectives believe happened to Kim Antonakis beginning in the early morning of March 1st, 1995. On March 1st, at about 4 a.m., the kidnappers sat crouched behind a parked car a few feet away from Kim's garage. It was getting colder outside, and the kidnappers were tired of waiting. Finally, they saw a white Honda Civic coming down the street, and they knew it had to be Kim's. And so the kidnappers stood up, and after confirming it was hers, they ducked back down. They were wearing all black clothes, gloves, and face masks, so they remained hidden in the darkness. From their crouched position, they watched as Kim's car pulled into the garage, and they waited right outside. Once the overhead light inside of the garage went out, each of the kidnappers crept inside and crouched down on opposite sides of Kim's car. The hip-hop music from inside the car cut out, and then Kim turned off the engine. At this point, the kidnappers were totally still, fixated on the driver's side door. The door opened and Kim stepped out, but immediately she stopped, because when she looked to one side of the garage and then the other, she saw something moving around, she heard something, it scared her, and so she began rushing towards the open garage door. At this point, one of the kidnappers leapt out of the darkness and surprised Kim from behind. They wrapped their arms around her, but Kim screamed and thrashed with her elbows and almost broke free. She scraped her long fingernails down the kidnapper's arm and thrust her keys at the kidnapper's face. And finally, the kidnapper's grip loosened and Kim got away. Kim made a break for it, but at this point, the other kidnapper leapt at her and brought her to the ground. It was at this point one of her earrings fell out and landed on the ground. Kim kept on fighting, but the kidnapper now had her pinned, and then suddenly Kim's head slammed against the ground, completely stunning her. The kidnapper on top of Kim turned her over onto her stomach and pulled her arms behind her back. At this point, the other one rushed over and unrolled a strip of duct tape and bound Kim's hands behind her back. Then both kidnappers flipped her back over. Kim would have felt a piece of duct tape being stretched across her mouth, and then would have felt her head slam against the ground one more time, at which point she lost consciousness. The kidnappers lifted Kim up and threw her in the trunk of her own car, and then sped down the street in her car and drove from Brooklyn to Queens. They made their way to that abandoned house and parked right out front. The street was pitch black and nobody was out that early in the morning. So the kidnappers just pulled Kim out of the trunk and dragged her right into the abandoned house and down the steps into the basement. Once in the basement, Kim began regaining consciousness and she screamed through the tape, but the kidnappers threw her onto a chair, crouched down, taped her feet, and then walked out of the basement, locking the door behind them. Kim would remain in that basement for about 36 hours without food or water, just sitting in that chair all tied up until the cold sent her into the final stages of hypothermia. She drifted in and out of consciousness and started hallucinating, so she could never really tell if she was alone or if people were there with her. Then, in the early morning of March 4th, 3 days after Kim was kidnapped, the basement door flew open again. Kim's kidnappers remained at the top of the stairs, but Kim's killers walked down the steps into the basement, and one of them held a gas can. The killer with the gas can walked right up to Kim, and from the looks of it, Kim seemed dead. But the killer didn't care. The killer leaned down, kissed Kim on the forehead, and said, quote, "Shit happens and life sucks," end quote. But the truth was, Kim was not dead. Hypothermia had simply slowed down multiple functions of her body, so she appeared dead, but certainly was not. Which means Kim was fully alive when the killer doused her with gasoline, took several steps back, lit a match, and flung it at her, setting her on fire. Once the fire started, the killers and the kidnappers turned and fled the scene and watched from outside as the house went up in flames. Then the killer and the kidnappers got in 2 separate cars and drove away. Eventually, the killers made it back to Brooklyn and they split up. One just kind of walked the streets for a while the other went back to their apartment and checked in on their 2-year-old son before they went to bed. It would turn out the man who called himself Psycho, that police really believed must have had something to do with Kim's murder, had nothing to do with it. And as for Kim's father, Tommy, he loved his daughter more than he loved anyone, and he would never have done anything to hurt her, just like he said. The truth was, Kim's horrific murder had taken place simply because somebody wanted a new car. Josh Torres, the man who'd been staying at Kim's apartment with his girlfriend April and their 2-year-old son, really liked Kim's white Honda Civic. And he started thinking that he really wanted a car just like that, or one maybe even nicer. And Josh's good friend, Jay, just happened to be Kim's ex-boyfriend, and he knew firsthand that Kim's dad was rich and could easily hand over enough money for Josh to get whatever car he wanted. And Jay was willing to help Josh pull this off because deep down, Jay knew that Kim did not really love him the way he loved her, and so he knew this relationship was never really going to amount to much. And also, Jay figured he wasn't really ripping Kim off, he was just ripping off her rich dad, who could easily afford giving up some money. And so Josh came up with a plan to kidnap Kim and get ransom money from her dad. And he reached out to 2 friends to pull off the kidnapping job, and one of them lived near an abandoned house that he said would be the perfect place to stash Kim until her dad forked over the ransom money. Jay, who knew Kim's schedule really well, helped the other guys, the kidnappers, work out the details of the plan and pick the perfect time to put it in motion. And in the early morning of March 4th, when Kim was kidnapped, everything seemed to be going the way it was supposed to. But later that day, things began to fall apart. After the kidnapping, Josh called Kim's father, Tommy, and played him a pre-recorded ransom demand, telling Tommy to leave $75,000 at a specific location at a specific time. But Tommy's answering machine did not pick up the recorded message. Instead, it just sounded like static, and Tommy had no idea that message had anything to do with his daughter. And when Tommy showed up at the apartment asking Josh for help, Josh panicked. So he did everything he could to make it look like he was desperately trying to find Kim, while he and Jay secretly figured out a different way to get Tommy the ransom message. But then everything changed again when Kim's mother came to town and visited the psychic and played that recording for Josh and Jay. because the psychic correctly said Kim was no longer in Brooklyn and that she was in a cold, dark basement. But more importantly, the psychic did not just mention the letter T floating around, she also said that she kept seeing one other letter, the letter J. And when Josh and Jay heard that, they freaked out because their names begin with J. And so, totally convinced the psychic knew exactly what was happening, Josh and Jay went to that abandoned house where Kim was with the two guys they had hired to kidnap Kim. Josh had picked up a gas can on the way over, claiming they would just move Kim to a different location and then burn the abandoned house down, kind of destroying evidence. But investigators would never know if that was actually Josh's intention. Because when Josh saw Kim in the basement and thought she was dead, even though she wasn't, she was just hypothermic, Josh would say he felt like the only way to deal with the situation was to light her on fire and burn her body along with the house, destroying all evidence. But of course, Kim was actually alive. Detectives Pia and Shelvin had actually begun to suspect Josh and Jay when that dead young man turned up in Queens, the guy who was shot out in the street, mafia execution style. That young man, who would turn out to be one of Kim's kidnappers, had connections to both Josh and Jay. But it was ultimately Blondie, the woman who had been attacked by her boyfriend, who broke the case wide open. Because Blondie's boyfriend at the time was Josh. Not long after Kim's murder, he had left April and their kid and started seeing Blondie. Police arrested both Josh and Jay, and Detective Pia very quickly got Jay to tell him absolutely everything that had happened. In fact, Jay cut a deal with the prosecution and would only serve 2 years in prison. As for Josh, he was not found guilty of the execution-style murder in Queens of that young man. However, he was found guilty of kidnapping and murdering Kim and was sentenced to 58 years to life in prison. It was mid-June 2014 in Highland Springs, a small blue-collar town about 4 miles outside of Richmond, Virginia. By 3 p.m. that day, it would be hot, 91 degrees Fahrenheit. But right then, at 6:30 in the morning, it was cool. With the sun fully visible in the sky, 16-year-old Martre Coles watched from the living room window of his family's single-story plain white house as his father climbed into his car, turned on his engine, and drove off to work. After he was gone, Martre left the window and walked through the empty house to his bedroom. Once inside, he sat down at his desk, he opened his sketchbook, and he started to draw. Unlike his usual artwork, which consisted of anime-stylized faces and figures full of color, energy, and movement, the faces that he drew that morning were done in thick black marker and were angry and sad. He drew X's instead of eyes, and he put slash marks where the mouths should go. A few minutes later, Martre put down the marker, he put his face in his hands, and he started to cry. 5 days earlier, on June 14th, 2014, Martre's beloved mother, 42-year-old Karina Coles, had died unexpectedly following complications from what was supposed to be routine hip surgery. Martre was beyond devastated. Over the last few years, he had become very close with his mother, as he was the last child of 8 siblings to still be living at home with the parents. His father, Maurice, had always been very hard on him, but his mother had always been his #1 cheerleader, always encouraging him to keep a portfolio of the video game characters and intricately illustrated storylines that he loved to create. She told him she was certain his artwork skills would land him a great job someday. And even though Martre didn't always feel as confident in himself as she did, it was nice to hear her say things like that. With his mother's funeral just 2 days away, the only thing keeping Martre going was the thought that his mom would never want him to just give up or to give in to the crushing depression and sadness he was feeling. And so Martre lifted his face out of his hands, he wiped away his tears, then he ripped the angry, sad drawings he had just made out of his sketchbook and he balled it up and he threw it in the trash. He wished he could talk to his dad about how terrible he was feeling right now, but he knew his dad wouldn't want to listen. He never did. Martre's father barely spoke to him, and whenever he did, it was almost always to be critical of him. As Martre sat there motionless in his desk seat, he suddenly hoped that his father's friend, a 45-year-old woman named Denise Gay, wouldn't be coming by again that night. Denise worked with Martre's dad at a food packaging company called Smithfield Foods. She had 2 children of her own, a 9-year-old little girl and a 19-year-old daughter who lived on her own 90 minutes away. Martre had no issue with Denise herself. She was perfectly nice, but Martre just didn't like that there was this new woman spending time in their house so soon after his mom had died. It just felt inappropriate. Martre had also quietly hoped that his mother's death would bring him and his father closer together, but the opposite was happening. Instead of turning to his son in this difficult time, Maurice was turning more and more to Denise. By June 21st, just 1 week after Martre's mother's death, Denise was coming over their house nearly every night. And in mid-July, just 1 month after Martre's mother's death, Maurice announced to Martre and his other siblings that Denise, along with her 9-year-old daughter Alana, were going to be moving in with him and with Martre. Despite protests from Martre's older sisters, Michelle and Marquisha, that their father's relationship was progressing way too fast, and that Martre was still very emotionally fragile following his mother's death, Maurice had made up his mind. He didn't care what Martre's feelings about the situation were. A couple days later, when Denise and Alana pulled up outside of Martre's house with their bags in hand, Martre stayed inside. He didn't want to see them. But his father began angrily yelling for him to come outside and meet his new family and help his stepsister with her luggage. Martre sighed and stood up and walked outside. He didn't smile at them, but he waved, and then he walked over to Alana to offer to carry her bag inside. But when he reached her, she clutched her bag more tightly to her chest. Then she glared at him angrily, and then she very intentionally threw her bag at his feet. Martre was annoyed, and he looked up at her like, "What are you doing?" But he didn't say anything. He just bent down, grabbed her bag, and then led the way back into the house. Later that day, Martre's older sisters called him to let him know that he was welcome to stay with them anytime he wanted. They knew his new living situation with Denise and Alana was going to be super awkward, and they knew Martre was just hurting from the death of their mother and he really needed someone around him that actually cared about him. Martre thanked them and said, "Yep, sure, I'll come by sometime." But secretly, Martre knew he probably wouldn't. He just didn't have the energy to do anything these days. According to Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn Knight, who was a fellow student at Highland Springs High School, Martre had big plans for his future, plans that his mother had encouraged him to pursue. Martre wanted to get into the best art school he possibly could, and then with that degree, he could try to land a highly coveted job as a video game artist and animator. And so over the first few months that Denise and Alana were living with him, Martre did his best to completely ignore them and instead spend his time and energy on his artwork. And over those first few months, Martre's art skills got noticeably better, and he started branching out from drawing and painting into the creation of elaborate and beautiful papier-mâché masks. But perhaps the most significant thing about this particular period of time in Martre's life was that after about 6 months of living with Denise, his resentment for her had given way to affection. She could never replace his mother, but she was very kind to him, and slowly, she had become a maternal figure to him. She had become someone he turned to when he was down. However, as much as Martre's relationship with Denise seemed to be evolving in a positive way, his relationship with her daughter Alana was going the other direction. Alana was clearly unhappy living with the Coles, and so she took out her frustration by constantly picking fights with Martre. At first, it was just small stuff like stealing the TV remote from Martre or being loud and obnoxious to annoy him. But eventually, it turned into more elaborate torment. Specifically, Alana realized that Maurice, Martre's father, would always take her side over his son's. And so using that information, she began breaking things around the house and telling Maurice that Martre did it. And every time, despite Martre proclaiming his innocence, Maurice would scream and yell at him and punish him in some way. Alana also quickly realized how important Martre's art was to him, and so she would routinely sneak into his room and vandalize his sketches and his masks. Martre had tried turning to Denise for help, but he was finding that she seemed to be in denial about how badly behaved her daughter really was. Martre also sensed that Denise was desperate to maintain her relationship with his father, and so she probably didn't want to fully acknowledge just how bad it was getting between he and Alana, because doing that would call their entire living arrangement into question, which would potentially jeopardize their future together as a cohesive family. And so Denise really didn't do anything to stop her daughter. Finally, in the winter of 2016, so 2 years after Denise and Alana had moved in, the tension in the household boiled over into violence. Early one afternoon, when Maurice and Denise were still at work, and Martre was sitting on the couch in the living room, Alana slipped into the kitchen, she opened the utensil drawer, and she pulled out a pair of utility scissors with long pointed blades. And then the 12-year-old walked back into the living room where Martre was, and she snuck up behind him, she pulled out the scissors, and then she leapt around the corner and she jumped on top of him and attempted to stab him in the heart. And Martre, at the last second, reached up and kind of pushed her arm out of the way, but the blades dug into his left shoulder and they went in deep. Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn, remembers the very angry call she got from Martre that night after Denise had cleaned and bandaged the wound on his shoulder and had apologized on behalf of Alana, but that was it. And so for Martre, this was the breaking point. He was furious that his father and Denise had just totally let the situation with Alana get completely out of control, and he was just kind of scared of Alana. That was a real attack on him. And so as he talked to Ashlyn that night, he said to her, I really need to start actually focusing on how I'm going to execute my plan and actually get into art school and get out of this insane household and go pursue my dreams. And Ashlyn agreed, and she encouraged him and said, yes, go do that. And so in mid-December 2016, Martre worked up the courage to go approach his father and ask him if he would sit down with Martre and try to fill out some financial paperwork that would help him get funding to go to college. And as he's trying to explain to his dad why he needs this funding and what he's going to do with his degree, Maurice, his dad, just kind of puts his hand up and says, you know what? I didn't go to college. I don't understand any of this stuff. You're on your own, kid. Martre was kind of crushed because he needed his dad to fill in the paperwork to be eligible for financial aid. But luckily, Denise was sitting nearby. She had overheard the conversation, and after Maurice had left the room, she pulled Martre aside and said, you know what, don't worry about it. I will get the information you need. I'll help you fill it out. We'll get you into college. You'll be fine. And so over the next few months, with Denise's help and encouragement, Martre not only filled out the financial aid paperwork, but he also sent out applications and letters of inquiry to various art colleges. And then, in March of 2017, roughly 3 years since his mother had died, Martre received the best news he had ever gotten. On March 4th at 4:17 in the afternoon, while Martre worked at his computer, he heard the ping of an incoming email. One click later, and he was reading an invitation from Full Sail University, an art school in Florida, asking him if he would like to come take a personalized tour of their campus. The administrator who had sent the email, Sheila Crenshaw, told Martre that she and her staff had been very impressed with the pictures of his artwork that he had sent along, and so they would love to get to know him and see if the school was a good fit. Sheila told Martre that if he wanted to come and do this tour, to be sure to bring along at least one of his papier-mâché masks, as well as his portfolio of drawings. Martre was so excited, he leapt from his chair and he ran into the room next door where Denise was, and after telling her the good news, she jumped up too, and the pair laughed and hugged and talked about how it was really happening. Martre was really going to go to art school and pursue his dreams. After they calmed down, Denise booked Martre a seat on a bus that would take him from Richmond, Virginia to Florida on Sunday, March 12th. The tour was scheduled for the following Monday. After his travel was booked, Martre realized he only had 8 days until he would be leaving, so right away he got to work making a special papier-mâché mask that he would bring along. He wanted to make sure he really impressed the Full Sail staff. On March 11th, the night before Martre was scheduled to ride out to Florida, Martre stayed with his older sister Michelle at her house. They spent the evening excitedly talking about his potential future at Full Sail and how happy this invitation would have made their mother, whose birthday was coming up later that month. The next morning, Michelle and Martre hopped in Michelle's car, and she began driving toward Martre's house. Their dad had agreed to give Martre a ride to the bus station later that day. When they arrived, Michelle gave her brother a big hug, she wished him good luck, and told him to text her as soon as he got to Florida, and he said he would. After Michelle got back in her car and she began to drive to work, she felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. She knew her little brother still missed their mother terribly, and even talked about his own death and how, at least when that happened, he would be with their mom. But finally, this invitation to Full Sail seemed like the break he so desperately needed. When Martre walked into his house that morning, Denise and her older daughter, Latoya, were both in the kitchen chatting and drinking coffee. When Denise saw Martre, she told him that his dad had apparently got called into work that day, so he couldn't give him a ride to the bus stop. However, she and her daughter didn't mind. He thanked them, and then he sat down with them, and for a few minutes the trio drank their coffee and chatted about Full Sail and other things. And then eventually, Martre told them that he still needed to pack, so he got up and he headed to his bedroom. As he got his clothes and his papier-mâché mask and other artwork together, he smiled. In less than an hour, he'd be on a bus headed to Florida, and he'd be officially pursuing his dreams. Since Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn, had known she would not see Martre in person before he left for Florida, and they both knew that Martre might not be able to charge his phone during the 18-hour-long bus ride, they had arranged for Martre to text her as soon as he got on the bus so she could say goodbye. But at the time Martre should have been on the bus texting her, he didn't. He didn't text, he didn't call, it was just silent. And over the course of the morning, despite Ashlyn calling and texting him repeatedly, Martre never responded. Around noon, Ashlyn called Martre's sisters, Michelle and Marquisha, asking if they had heard from their brother, and they said no. By late afternoon, when still there was silence from Martre, Ashlyn, Michelle, and Marquisha were becoming frantic. They all knew that even 3 years after his mother's death, Martre still suffered occasional deep bouts of depression when he started thinking about his mom. And so the 3 young women started worrying that he might have harmed himself. That's why they're not hearing from him. So at 4 p.m. that afternoon, Martre's sisters rushed to their father's house to see what their father and Denise knew. And when they got there, they met up with Denise and LaToya, who were out in the front yard. And after listening to Martre's sisters, Denise was stunned. She had been with Martre that morning. She had seen him leave. What could have happened? How could anything be wrong? But when Maurice, who at some point had come outside to see what was going on, heard the news, he was completely unconcerned that his son seemed to have just vanished right off the face of the earth. He told his daughters that Martre hadn't even been gone long enough to have reached Florida. It was an 18-hour trip. He probably was just asleep on the bus. And if he didn't show up at school tomorrow for the tour, well, Martre was 19 years old. He was an adult, so whatever he wanted to do, that was on him. Completely unsettled by their father's utter indifference about this, Martre's sisters left the house and met up with Ashlyn, who was now hysterical. After they calmed her down, the 3 women eventually decided that their best bet right now was just to search the neighborhood for Martre. Denise said she had dropped him off at the bus stop, but she didn't actually see him get on the bus and literally drive away. So the 3 young women are thinking, okay, well, maybe Martre never got on the bus. Maybe he's still in town somewhere. So the trio spread out all across Highland Springs. They went to local stores, to the high school, to the basketball court. They called and texted all of Martre's friends, but no one had seen or heard from Martre. The next morning, Monday, March 13th, they called Full Sail University to see if Martre had arrived for his tour, and the answer was no. Immediately, Michelle and Marquisha jumped in their car and they headed for the local police station where they filed a missing persons report on their brother. They gave the police a picture and description of Martre, but police told them that because Martre was an adult and there was no sign of foul play, there really wasn't much they could do. Meanwhile, Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn, who knew Martre's email password, decided to take a closer look at Martre's invitation from Full Sail University. When he had shown it to her 10 days earlier, she had noticed something slightly off about it, but she had forgotten all about it once they had read the good news and were celebrating. But now, when she logged into his email account and opened up the invitation again, she immediately saw why she thought the email was concerning. The email had not been sent from an official Full Sail University account. Instead, it had come from someone's personal Gmail account, a woman named Sheila Crenshaw. Ashlyn pulled out her cell phone and she called Full Sail again. And a few minutes later, Ashlyn's worst fears were confirmed. No one by that name worked at the university. But shockingly, when Martre's father, Maurice, was told about this new wrinkle about the email address and how this meant Martre was almost certainly tricked or scammed before he went missing, Maurice still appeared unconcerned, and he refused to reach out to the police himself. 8 days later, Martre's mother's birthday came and went, and still there was no trace of Martre. Since their mother's death, all of the siblings started getting together on her birthdays to celebrate her life and spend time together. And Martre cherished these get-togethers. So for him not to at least text or call his family on her birthday was very significant. It was starting to feel almost likely that he had taken his own life. But just a week later, everything would change. On April 2nd, 2017, 3 weeks after Martre was reported missing, a man named Larry Anderson was walking in a wooded area near where the Coles lived when he spotted a strange green plastic bin tucked away inside of a thick bush. He walked off of the trail to get a better look at it, but when he got close enough to actually see what was inside of this bin, he stopped where he was, he pulled out his phone, and he dialed 911. When the police arrived, they found Larry, who was visibly very shaken up, and he was pacing along the trail a couple hundred feet away, and then the police moved from Larry to the actual bin under the bush, and when they got up close, they saw what Larry saw. There was clearly a foot with a sneaker on it poking out of the bin. When they removed the cover of the bin completely and actually got a full view inside, they saw the dead body of a young man folded up like an accordion, crammed inside. He was wearing blue jeans and he had a dark sweatshirt on. His knees were jackknifed up against his chest at an impossible angle, and his hands were bound behind his back with purple duct tape. There were no obvious wounds on his body. However, an autopsy would later reveal that the cause of his death was suffocation. The medical examiner also told police that present in the blood were high levels of two drugs, the sleep agent trazodone and the club drug gamma-butyrolactone, which makes users feel relaxed and euphoric. Even though there was no wallet or ID on this body, when detectives ran a general description of the young man's appearance through their database, right away they found a match to a missing person report that had been filed 3 weeks earlier on March 13th. The deceased young man inside of the storage bin was Martre Coles. Before the police told Martre's family the horrible news, they received a surprising phone call from another police sergeant. He had heard about the murder, and he had just connected Martre's name and his address to a false burglar alarm that 2 of his officers had responded to on March 31st, which was 2 days before Martre's body was discovered. After following up on this very bizarre connection the sergeant had made, and using evidence they had found at the scene where Martre's body was discovered, police were able to slowly, bit by bit, piece together the story of who killed Martre and why. Back on Friday, March 31st, so 2 days before Martre was found, that sergeant's 2 police officers responded to a burglar alarm at Martre's home. When they arrived at Martre's home, Alana came to the door. Standing next to her was her older sister, Latoya. Now, neither of these 2 responding officers had any idea that there was a missing person report out on another member of their family. Latoya told the officers that she was really sorry that the burglar alarm they were responding to was actually a false alarm. She told them, while glaring down at her sister Alana, that her younger sister had deliberately set the alarm off and she was about to be punished for it. The police asked a few more questions, and then feeling satisfied that this really was just a false alarm because this kid pulled it, they turned around to leave. But before they did, Alana suddenly blurted out, "Can I talk to you guys, please, alone?" And then Alana promptly stepped forward away from her sister out of the house into the evening darkness, and she and one of the officers walked over to the police car they had come in on, while the other police officer stayed put at the door with Latoya, keeping her from going out there. Once Alana was far enough away that she didn't think Latoya or any of her other family members in the house could hear her, she turned to the officer and told him a story that was so outrageous and so unexpected that it just did not seem true. And so after Alana was done telling this story and had gone back inside with Latoya and the door had shut and the 2 responding officers said bye and they were leaving, they discussed it in the car, those 2 officers, and they decided there's no way that could be true. And so when they got back to the station, they filed their report as usual, describing that this was a false alarm, and then they also wrote down in this report what Alana told them, her crazy story, but they didn't alert anyone to this story. They just basically made a note of it, and then they filed their report with their sergeant and thought nothing of it. 3 days later, when their sergeant learned that the murder victim found in the storage bin was Alana's stepbrother, the sergeant suddenly remembered the report and realized the story Alana had told his officers might actually be true. Based on a combination of Alana's story, along with other pieces of evidence that the police collected, the following is a reconstruction of what actually happened to Martre. Back on the morning of Sunday, March 12th, so the day Martre was scheduled to take the bus to Florida, his older sister Michelle dropped him back off in front of his house and gave him a hug before she left for work. When Martre walked through the front doors into his house, Denise and her daughter Latoya were sitting in the kitchen. Martre sat down, and as the trio chatted, Martre didn't realize the cup of coffee he was drinking was almost certainly laced with the 2 drugs that the medical examiner would later find in his system, trazodone and gamma-butyrolactone. By the time Martre got up from the table and headed to his bedroom to pack for his trip to the college, the drugs would have likely begun taking effect. As he stepped into his bedroom, he likely would have started to wonder why he was feeling so crushingly tired and lethargic. He also was probably wondering why Denise and Latoya had followed him into his room and pushed his door most of the way closed without saying a word. Across the hall, Alana was in her room when she heard a loud shout. The voice was weak, but the words were clear. "Get off of me!" She recognized the voice as Martre's. She stepped out of her bedroom and pushed the door of Martre's room open a little to see what was going on, and what she saw was Martre on his back on the ground, and her mother, Denise, standing over his head while kind of bent forward. She was pressing her hands directly down onto his chest, basically putting all of her weight onto his chest, crushing him. Alana's sister, Latoya, was sitting on Martre's legs trying to hold them down because Martre was kicking her and trying to get up. As Martre continued to yell out for them to get off of him, his voice became weaker and weaker as he wasn't able to fully expand his chest to get a full breath because Denise was crushing his chest. Suddenly, Denise looked up and she saw Alana standing in the doorway. Without releasing the pressure on Martre's chest, she simply said to Alana in an unnaturally calm voice, "Nothing is happening. Go back to your room." Alana, who had learned over the years that it was a bad idea to cross her mother, did what she was told, and she kind of backed out into the hallway, and then a few steps more and she was behind her closed bedroom door, her heart pounding wildly. Back inside of Martre's room, Denise was starting to panic. She wished Alana hadn't seen, but now if she didn't finish Martre off, his yells for help, as weak as they were, might alert others. So while keeping the pressure firmly applied to his chest, Denise looked around and saw the papier-mâché mask Martre had so carefully made for his trip to the college laying on the ground near them. She took one hand off of his chest, so she's still pressing with the other, and she reached and she picked the mask up, and then she placed it over Martre's face, completely blocking his nose and mouth, and then began pressing down on his face as well. Then she leaned forward and put her knee into the center of his chest, right on his sternum, and put all of her weight onto her knee, and then she shifted the hand that had been on his chest up to his throat, and she began pressing as hard as she could on his throat. And so she maintained all 3 points of pressure, his chest, his neck, and his face, until Martre stopped moving. A few minutes later, across the hall in her bedroom, Alana heard the sound of something plastic being dragged over the floor. Although terrified, she opened her bedroom door just enough to look into the hallway, and this time she saw her sister Latoya pulling a large, heavy green storage bin across the floor. A few minutes later, Alana looked out her bedroom window, and she saw her mother and sister hoist this green tub into the back of Denise's car, and then the two of them drove away. After they were gone, Alana quietly closed the door to her bedroom, and then she sat on her bed, and she's thinking to herself, this has to be a dream, this can't be real. But then later that day, when Martre's sisters came over to their house in a total panic, saying that Martre wasn't responding to any texts or calls and we think he's missing, that's when Alana knew this had not been a dream. What she had just seen had really happened. Over the next few days, Alana kept hoping that Martre would just show up, that he'd walk through the door and that everything would go back to normal. But that didn't happen. And 19 days later, on March 31st, Alana was unable to carry this secret any longer. And so she waited until dark, and then she intentionally set off the family burglar alarm, knowing it would trigger police to come to her house, and then she could tell them her secret. When Alana stepped outside of the house to talk privately to one of the responding police officers, their conversation was captured on body camera. She turned her face up towards the officer and whispered 7 words that would blow this murder case wide open. "I saw my mom kill my stepbrother." It would turn out Denise had decided a long time ago that the only way to really secure her relationship with Maurice and to create the family she wanted was to get rid of any reminders of Maurice's dead wife. And Martre, with his mother's wide smile and many of her mannerisms, had done everything he could to keep his mother's memory alive. Even his depression over her loss only reminded everyone how much she had meant to her family. Denise was also worried that Maurice might begin to see her own daughter, Alana, as a liability because of the constant bickering between her and Martre. So when Denise overheard Martre talking to his father about trying to secure financial aid so he could go off to art college, she saw an opportunity to make him disappear from her life altogether. That email Martre received inviting him to Full Sail University had not been sent by the college. It had been sent by Denise, who was sitting right in the next room on her laptop. And before sending that email, Denise had actually called and texted her older daughter, Latoya, and explained her plan for killing Martre, and she asked Latoya to help her, and she agreed. On April 3rd, one day after Martre's body was found, the detectives working on the murder case were getting ready to inform Martre's family that he was dead. But when the sergeant, whose officers had spoken to Alana, called to tell those investigators what Alana had said about her mother's involvement in Martre's murder, the detectives decided to hold off telling Martre's family that he was dead. If, in fact, Martre's murderer was someone inside of his own family in his own house, police did not want to tip them off by telling them that they had discovered Martre's body. Instead, investigators dug into Denise's background and they found a long history of felonies, from passing worthless checks to charges of computer fraud that had landed her in jail more than once. Then, under the guise of following up on Martre's missing person report, police returned to the Coles house to interview Maurice, Denise, and Latoya again. This time, police pressured Latoya and her mom for any information they might have about Martre's whereabouts, hoping that maybe the murderer would get spooked and do something suspicious or incriminating. At the same time, police put the green storage container that had held Martre's body back where it was first discovered in the park. Then they set up video cameras to record any activity around it. And within days, both Latoya and her mother Denise were spotted returning to the wooded area where they had left Martre's body and, much to their shock, finding the bin now empty. Police also discovered that shortly before Martre's disappearance, Denise had purchased a shovel, purple duct tape, and a substance called lime that can be used to prevent decomposition of human flesh. But most damning of all, cell phone and computer records confirmed that both Denise and Latoya had been to the wooded park on March 12th, the day Martre went missing, and these records confirmed that Denise was definitely the author of the email from Full Sail University. It was that invitation, the most promising and exciting event in Martre's life that his mother would have been so proud of him for, that lured him to his death. On July 11th, 2018, 49-year-old Denise Gay was sentenced to life in prison. Her daughter, 23-year-old Latoya Gay, was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Despite being a less than stellar parent, Maurice Coles had nothing to do with his son's death. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please cut in front of the 5-star review button who has been patiently waiting for their turn in the 10 items or less checkout line at the grocery store, and then proceed to pay for your completely overflowing cart with a Ziploc bag full of change. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I